Hello everyone, and God bless you. Tonight, we're going on an incredible journey into one of the most memorable and inspiring stories in the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. As we follow David's path, you'll witness the courage it takes to face a giant, the strength found in faith, and the power of trusting in God when the odds seem impossible. Please do comment below to let me know where in the world you are listening from, and subscribe to our channel to join our Christian community. Okay, let's get comfy, settle in, and we'll begin this timeless tale of bravery, faith, and God's mighty hand at work. Chapter 1. A Young Shepherd's Heart. In a land of rolling hills and golden fields, where the sun warmed the earth and a gentle breeze rustled through olive trees, a young boy named David watched over his father's sheep. David was just a shepherd, the youngest of his brothers, but he carried a heart full of love and a quiet trust in God that made him different. As he sat on a grassy hill, surrounded by his flock, he often played his harp, filling the air with soft melodies that seemed to dance with the wind. His songs were gentle and sweet, a peaceful praise to the God he loved with all his heart. The sheep grazed calmly, trusting David to lead them to green pastures and still waters. He knew each of them by sight, guiding them with a soft call or a simple tap of his staff. If ever a lamb strayed too far, he would gently carry it back in his arms, whispering words of comfort. David's life was simple, yet filled with moments of quiet beauty, waking up with the first light of dawn, feeling the earth cool beneath his feet, and watching the stars light up the night sky as he whispered prayers to God. He felt God's presence in everything around him, from the chirping of crickets to the babbling stream that flowed through the valley. One morning, as David was tending to his sheep, he noticed a faint rustling in the bushes. Without fear, he stood up, ready to protect his flock. He had fought off bears and lions before, using only his sling and his faith in God's strength. He knew he wasn't strong like his older brothers or mighty like the soldiers in King Saul's army, but he had a brave heart that trusted in God's protection. David's father, Jesse, called to him from the fields. He had a message for David, one that would change the course of his life forever. Little did David know, while he was singing his hymns and guarding his sheep, a great challenge was waiting on the horizon. Far away, the armies of Israel stood frozen in fear, and a giant named Goliath had stepped into the valley, roaring with a voice that shook the ground. But for now, David's world was calm. He played one last song on his harp as the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over the hills. He felt a sense of peace wash over him, as if God was whispering a promise to his heart. Be strong and courageous. I am with you. Chapter 2. The Threat of Goliath. Far beyond the quiet hills where David watched over his sheep, a different scene was unfolding in the valley of Elah. The once peaceful land now echoed with the clashing of armor and the tense murmurs of soldiers. On one side of the valley, the army of Israel gathered, their faces filled with fear and uncertainty. Across from them, on the opposite hill, stood the mighty Philistine army, their banners waving in the wind like dark shadows against the sky. The two armies faced each other, but no one dared to make the first move. The reason for their hesitation stood right at the front of the Philistine line, a giant of a man named Goliath. Goliath was unlike anyone they had ever seen. He towered over the other soldiers, his armor gleaming like bronze in the sunlight. He wore a heavy helmet, and his massive shield was carried by another man who could barely keep up with his strides. In his hand, he held a spear as thick as a tree trunk, its iron tip shining like a sword. Goliath's voice was a roar that seemed to shake the ground as he stepped forward, staring down the army of Israel with eyes full of scorn. "Why do you come out and line up for battle?" Goliath shouted, his deep voice echoing through the valley. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of King Saul? Choose a man to come down and fight me. If he can kill me, we will become your servants. But if I defeat him, you will serve us." Every day for 40 days, Goliath came forward, repeating his challenge. The soldiers of Israel trembled at the sound of his voice. They had never seen a warrior like him, so strong, so confident, so impossibly large. King Saul himself, a tall and mighty leader, felt his courage waver as he listened to Goliath's taunts. The men whispered among themselves, their voices filled with fear and doubt. Who can fight this giant? Who could possibly stand against him? In the distance, young David knew nothing of the giant or the fear that had gripped the army of Israel. He was still in the fields, tending his sheep, unaware that a great battle was looming. But back at his father's home, Jesse watched the road anxiously. 3 of David's older brothers had already joined King Saul's army, and every day, Jesse wondered how they were faring on the battlefield. One morning, Jesse called David into the house. "Take this basket of bread and cheese to your brothers," he said, placing the food into David's hands. "See how they are and bring back word of their well-being." David's heart quickened with excitement. He loved his brothers dearly and had missed them since they left for the battle. He didn't know what awaited him in the valley of Elah, but he felt a stirring in his spirit, a sense that God was leading him into something greater than he could understand. The journey to the battlefield was long, but David's steps were light as he made his way down the dusty path, humming a soft song of praise. As he drew closer, the sounds of the soldiers' shouts and the clanging of weapons filled the air. The peaceful fields and hills gave way to the tense energy of the battle camp. David could see the fear etched on the faces of the men as they stared across the valley. "What's happening?" David asked one of the soldiers as he arrived at the camp. The man pointed toward the opposite hill, where Goliath was once again stepping forward, his voice booming across the valley. "Look," the soldier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Goliath the giant. He comes every day taunting us. No one dares to fight him." David turned his gaze toward the giant, watching him with a calm, steady look. The fear that gripped the others didn't seem to touch him. Instead, a different kind of fire burned in his eyes, a spark of courage and faith that came from deep within his heart. Goliath raised his voice once more, taunting the army of Israel. "Is there no one brave enough to face me? Come, send out your best warrior, and let him meet his fate." The men around David trembled, stepping back in fear. But David's heart was steady, filled with a quiet trust in God. He looked up, the sunlight reflecting off the giant's armor, but he was not blinded by fear. Instead, he felt a strange and powerful assurance, as if God himself was placing a shield of courage over his heart. "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel?" David asked, his voice clear and strong. The soldiers turned to him in surprise, seeing not just a young shepherd boy, but someone who carried the weight of a greater faith. Chapter 3: David's decision to face Goliath. David stood among the soldiers, his heart racing but not with fear, with purpose. He had never seen his brothers and the men of Israel like this, faces pale, eyes wide with dread. The sight of the giant Goliath did not stir terror in David's heart. Instead, it filled him with a righteous anger. How could this Philistine defy the armies of the living God? How could he stand there, day after day, mocking not just Israel but God himself? As the soldiers muttered and shook their heads, David stepped forward and spoke again. "What will be done for the man who defeats this Philistine?" he asked. His voice was louder this time, drawing attention from all around him. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? His brothers, standing nearby, heard him and frowned. Eliab, the oldest, pushed his way through the crowd to confront David. "Why have you come down here?" he snapped, his face twisted with irritation. "And who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know your pride and the naughtiness of your heart. You just wanted to see the battle." David looked up at his brother, his expression calm. "What have I done now?" he asked, spreading his hands. "Can't I even speak?" He turned away, moving closer to the front lines, undeterred by his brother's harsh words. He wasn't here for his own glory. He felt a deeper calling, a pull in his spirit that urged him to act. As David asked again about Goliath, word of his questions spread quickly through the camp until it reached King Saul himself. The king sent for David, and the young shepherd was led into the royal tent. Saul's eyes narrowed as he looked at the boy standing before him. Small, unarmored, just a young man with a shepherd's staff. "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine," David said, his voice strong with conviction. "Your servant will go and fight him." Saul's face softened with pity. He shook his head, trying to hide a sad smile. "You cannot go out against this Philistine to fight him," he said gently. "You are only a young man, and he has been a warrior since his youth." David stepped closer, his eyes shining with a light Saul hadn't seen before, even among his bravest soldiers. "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep," David began. "Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." David's voice grew quieter, but it held a fierce, unshakable faith. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul gazed at David, searching his face for any hint of fear or doubt, but found none. He saw only pure, unwavering belief, a faith that seemed to shine from the very depths of the boy's heart. Slowly, the king nodded, resigned but moved by David's courage. "Go, and the Lord be with you," Saul said softly. Saul offered David his own armor, a bronze helmet, a heavy coat of mail, and a sword. But as David tried to move, the armor weighed him down. He struggled to take even a few steps, feeling awkward and constrained. "I cannot go in these," David said, shaking his head as he removed the armor. "I am not used to them." He placed the helmet and the sword back on the stand, setting them aside with a sense of relief. David didn't need the weight of armor. He carried something far greater in his heart, faith in the living God. With nothing but his shepherd's staff in one hand, David knelt by a brook that ran through the valley. He dipped his fingers into the cool, clear water, and the stream babbled gently, as if whispering its own quiet encouragement. From the smooth stones glistening beneath the surface, David chose 5, placing them carefully in his leather pouch. He held one in his hand for a moment, feeling its smoothness, and nodded to himself. This was all he needed. It wasn't the strength of weapons that would win this battle, it was the power of God. Standing tall, David took up his simple sling, the same one he'd used countless times in the fields, protecting his flock from danger. The sun warmed his back as he began to walk toward the place where the armies faced each other. Each step felt lighter than the last, as if the very ground beneath his feet were carrying him forward. Behind him, the soldiers of Israel watched, their mouths open in disbelief. "Is he really going?" they whispered. "He's just a boy. What can he do against Goliath?" But David wasn't looking back. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on the giant who towered in the distance, his shadow stretching long across the valley. The fear that gripped the hearts of the soldiers didn't touch David. He walked with a quiet confidence, his spirit lifted by a faith that was stronger than any armor, sharper than any sword. He knew he wasn't walking alone. He felt the presence of the Lord beside him, guiding his steps. This wasn't a battle of strength against strength. It was a test of faith, a moment where the power of God would be revealed in the simplest, most unexpected way. As David drew closer, he whispered a silent prayer, trusting fully in the one who had never let him down. The battle had yet to begin, but in David's heart, it was already won. Chapter 4. The Showdown, David versus Goliath. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the valley of Elah. The air was still, thick with the tension of 2 armies standing on the brink of battle. The Philistines lined one hillside, their armor gleaming, while the Israelites faced them from the other side, a sea of anxious faces. In the center of the valley, a single figure moved, a giant draped in heavy armor, a sword the size of a man slung at his side. It was Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, stomping forward with a thunderous step that echoed like distant drums. Goliath's booming laughter filled the air as he spotted David, the young shepherd boy, walking out from the ranks of Israel's army. "Am I a dog?" Goliath jeered, That you come at me with sticks?" He sneered at the sight of David, no armor, no sword, just a boy with a sling and a pouch of stones. The giant's voice thundered across the valley. "Come here," he roared, "and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." David, undeterred, stepped forward, planting his feet firmly on the ground. He looked up at Goliath, meeting his eyes with a steady, fearless gaze. "You come against me with sword, spear, and javelin," David called out, his voice strong and clear, carrying across the battlefield. "But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." The soldiers on both sides fell silent, leaning in to hear the boy's words. David continued, his face alight with faith and determination. "This day, the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. It is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Goliath's face twisted into a scornful grin, and he began to lumber forward, each step shaking the earth beneath him. He raised his spear, the tip gleaming in the sunlight, casting a bright flash across the valley. But David did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his pouch, his fingers closing around one smooth stone. He placed it carefully into his sling, his eyes never leaving Goliath's towering form. The battlefield seemed to hold its breath. David began to swing the sling in a gentle, rhythmic motion, the sound of the leather cutting through the air growing faster and faster. He felt the familiar tension as the stones circled above his head, a feeling that brought him back to the peaceful hills where he had protected his father's sheep. There was no fear here, only faith, as strong and unshakable as the mountains that surrounded them. In a single, fluid motion, David released the stone. It flew through the air like a bird, swift and sure. Time seemed to slow as every eye followed its path, watching as it struck Goliath square in the forehead. The stone sank deep, and the giant's expression of shock froze on his face. His great body wavered for a heartbeat, then crumpled like a felled tree, crashing to the ground with a tremendous thud. Silence swept over the valley. The Philistines stood in stunned disbelief, their mouths open, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The Israelites, too, were frozen, hardly daring to believe their eyes. The giant, the unbeatable warrior who had terrified them for weeks, lay motionless in the dust. It wasn't a great sword or spear that had brought him down. It was a simple stone, guided by the hand of a boy who believed in the power of God. David walked over to where Goliath lay, his chest rising and falling steadily. He bent down and drew the giant's own sword from its sheath, the blade heavy in his hand. With one swift motion, David brought the sword down, ending the battle once and for all. He stood up, lifting the sword high above his head as a symbol of victory, the sunlight glinting off the blade. A roar erupted from the ranks of the Israelites, a cheer of triumph that echoed across the valley, shaking the very ground they stood on. The Philistine soldiers, suddenly gripped with fear, turned and fled, their confidence shattered by the sight of their fallen champion. The Israelites surged forward, chasing after them with renewed courage, their shouts filling the air like the sound of rushing wind. But David did not join in the chase. He stood there quietly for a moment, looking down at Goliath's body. He wasn't gloating or celebrating. He knew this victory wasn't his own. It belonged to the Lord. The boy who had walked into the valley with nothing but a sling and a prayer had proven to the world that true strength comes not from weapons, but from faith in God's power. As the dust settled and the valley emptied, David turned and began to make his way back up the hillside. He was greeted with the joyful cries of his brothers and the soldiers, their faces alight with a new hope. But David's expression remained calm and peaceful, his heart filled with a quiet gratitude. He knew that the real battle had been won long before the stone left his sling. It was won in the moment he chose to trust in God completely, against all odds. David took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, the same sun that had shone down on him as he watched his sheep in the fields. He had faced a giant, but it was the same faith that had guided him then that had guided him now. And as he looked back at the valley, where the shadow of Goliath no longer loomed, David knew that this was just the beginning of the journey God had planned for him. Chapter 7. Victory and Reflection. As the dust of the battlefield began to settle, a wave of exhilaration swept over the Israelite army. Shouts of victory and cries of joy filled the air, echoing across the valley. They had witnessed a miracle. A young shepherd boy, armed with nothing more than a sling and a single stone, had triumphed over a giant who had struck fear into their hearts for days. The soldiers surged forward, chasing the Philistines who were now retreating in a panic, their once mighty ranks dissolving like sand washed away by the sea. David, however, did not join in the pursuit. He stood quietly on the hillside, watching the scene unfold below. His face, still streaked with dust and sweat, wore an expression of quiet awe. He knew that what had happened today was more than just a victory in battle. It was a demonstration of God's power and faithfulness. It wasn't David's skill or strength that had won the fight, but his trust in the Lord. He had faced the giant, not with the confidence of a seasoned warrior, but with the simple, unshakable faith of a young shepherd who knew that God was with him. The Israelites gathered around David, lifting him up in celebration. His brothers embraced him, their faces filled with pride and disbelief. King Saul himself stepped forward, his eyes wide with wonder. He looked at David, the boy who had done what no seasoned soldier had dared, and he nodded in respect. "You have saved Israel today," Saul said, his voice filled with gratitude. But David shook his head gently. "It was the Lord who delivered us," he replied humbly. "The battle belongs to him." As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the valley, the Israelites began their journey back to camp. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped them in the morning were now replaced with a deep, peaceful sense of relief. They walked with their heads held high, their hearts lighter, knowing they had witnessed the power of God working through the faith of a single, unlikely hero. David walked among them, feeling the gentle breeze on his face. He was no longer just the shepherd boy from Bethlehem. He was a symbol of courage and faith, a reminder to all of Israel that with God, all things are possible. He had faced Goliath not because he wanted glory or praise, but because he believed in a God who is greater than any giant, stronger than any fear. As they reached the edge of the valley, David paused and looked back one last time. The place that had been filled with tension and the shadow of Goliath now seemed calm and serene, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a peaceful scene, a promise of new beginnings. David took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer of thanks. He knew that this victory was just the start of a much bigger journey, one that would lead him down paths he couldn't yet imagine. He thought of the fields back home, the quiet hills where he used to play his harp and sing songs of praise. Even now, after all he had faced, he was still that same shepherd at heart. And he knew that the same God who had guided his sling today would guide his steps tomorrow. The people of Israel celebrated late into the night, their voices lifted in songs of joy and thanksgiving. They gathered around their fires, telling and retelling the story of the day's events, of the boy who defeated the giant. But as the stars appeared one by one in the night sky, a calm settled over the camp. The songs became softer, the laughter quieter, until only the gentle crackle of the fire could be heard. David sat by the fire, his brothers beside him, and looked up at the stars. He felt a deep, soothing peace wash over him, a peace that came not from the victory itself, but from the knowledge that he had placed his trust in the right place. He had faced a giant, but it was the faith inside him that had shone brightest today. As the last embers of the fire began to fade, David's eyes grew heavy. He lay back on the soft grass, gazing up at the vast, starry sky. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for guiding me, for giving me strength, and for showing everyone that you are with us." And with that quiet prayer, David closed his eyes, feeling the gentle pull of sleep. The worries of the day faded away, replaced by the comforting knowledge that God was watching over him, just as he always had. It was a peaceful end to a momentous day, a reminder to all who had witnessed it that, no matter how great the challenges they faced, they were never alone. In the stillness of the night, with the sounds of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant chirping of crickets, the valley rested in peace. And so did David, carried into sleep by a calm and unwavering faith, ready for whatever God had in store for him next. Thank you for joining us in this journey through the incredible story of David and Goliath. Please like this video if you enjoyed it and consider subscribing to our channel to join our community and for more videos like this. Now I wish you a peaceful and blessed sleep, and I'll see you on the next video. May God bless you.